Aloha, everyone. My name is Elena Hafine, and I'm the moderator for this morning's session titled The Good, Bad, and Ugly in Controlling Sediment Discharges. Please use the Q&A section during the presentation to ask any questions that you may have. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a few minutes for the speaker to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this session. Dr. Jerald Fifield started Hydrodynamics Incorporated in 1982, and he has been actively involved with drainage, sediment, and erosion control, water rights, and non-point pollution control. Through his company, he develops sediment and erosion control plans. He completes drainage analysis, provides inspection services, and teaches about controlling sediment and erosion on construction sites. Dr. Fifield founded the Worldwide Certified Inspector of Sediment and Erosion Control, the CISEC program, that educates and certifies qualified construction site inspectors of sediment and erosion control. In addition, Jerry has authored numerous professional papers. He's researched sediment and erosion control products and written sediment and erosion control manuals for designers and reviewers, along with field manuals for inspectors and contractors. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Jerald Fifield. Good morning, Jerry.
Good morning, Elena, and good morning, everybody. And just to rub it in a little bit, it's too bad you're not in Colorado right now. The temperature is 29 degrees Fahrenheit. I just thought I'd bring that part into everybody. Going to be providing information that if there were any type of individuals who might benefit the most from would be the reviewers and designers of sediment erosion control plans, but the entire presentation will also definitely benefit contractors as they implement what's necessary to meet up the requirements of the federal construction general permit, as well as the Hawaii Health Department requirements. So if we go through on these things, I want everybody to realize there's a basic definitions that indeed we're going to be working with. And as we go through, you'll see that little item come up on the lower left-hand part of your screen. It's a course that indeed is going to be offered in February of next year for designers and reviewers. Having said that, though, the most important part right now that we're concerned with is how do we minimize erosion? You cannot prevent erosion, and that's probably the first thing I want everybody to realize. But we can control or minimize sediment by minimizing erosion. And ironically, minimizing erosion during construction could very well be the least expensive cost of this endeavor. Because most of the time what happens, we are always trying to capture the sediment that's suspended in runoff waters themselves, and that is what costs the most money. So as we go through, keep these three items in mind: sediment control, the sedimentation, which is the process of capturing the particles that are suspended in water, and then erosion control. Those are our big three that we're going to be working with. Well, one of the questions that I get asked all the time is, how effective are these sediment control BMPs? Well, not going to be good news. The majority of BMPs that are out there to minimize sediment-laden discharges are relatively ineffective. But it's not because of the product. It's usually due to poor selection, poor installation, poor timing, and probably the biggest one of them all, lack of maintenance. The products rarely fail. It's us that are putting them in, evaluating them, and doing inspections that has the problems on here. And that's what the whole intent of this presentation is going to be about. Let's just go through a couple things that are commonly found in Hawaii. And these are pictures indeed that I have acquired while I've done work over in Hawaii itself. I'm going to go through, give you a series of photographs, the name of them, the intent of them. SC meaning sediment control, EC erosion control, WEC wind erosion control, And then there's the infamous none of the above. Let's just take this one that I've seen, not only in Hawaii, but I've seen it throughout the United States. And it's unfortunately being pretty well abused. For example, here we have what we classified as a wattle or a barrier or fiber roll. There's a whole bunch of different names for them. And whenever I come across something, I see one stake on one end of the product, and I go over and I see another stake on the other side of a 10-foot long wattle, I simply say, wow, these only work as long as it doesn't rain or we don't have any runoff conditions. But as soon as we get runoff conditions, you can be guaranteed that water is going to go underneath or over, and in some cases, it can go around. And that is a huge problem because the insulation is not installed correctly on this. And this by far is one of the bad situations that I keep encountering throughout the United States. If you keep something like this and runoff occurs, it's not going to be long before you start seeing pictures like this. Which brings up one of the words that I wanted to be very, make sure everybody's aware of in here. Call them fiber rolls or wattles. They are not, I repeat, they are not a standalone erosion control best management practice. We have people claim that it is, but they can be used in conjunction with other BMPs to incorporate erosion control. But by themselves, do not consider them to be an erosion control practice. So whenever you get something like this and somebody says, I've got an erosion control practice on the hillside, I would have to say, no, these are more sediment control. And what I'm seeing on that picture there is that it's a very ineffective technique. As a matter of fact, it would probably be better to put it into none of the above because there's just show and tell. And that is defeating the purpose of what we're trying to do to minimize pollutants going into the Pacific Ocean around the Hawaiian Islands. Well, there maybe are other ones. Let's just take one where somebody installs a fabric material underneath the grate of a drain. And when I look at pictures like this, first thing I ask myself, and it should be the same questions that should be asked of all the contractors that are attending today, where is the sediment? Well, you can see a little bit of sediment right up in there. But what is scary when I look at this picture is how clean the fabric material is. And that is due to one very, very good reason. The whole unit failed. I've seen these in Florida when we have worked in projects in Florida, and it seems like there's always one little spot that indeed looks like it's cleaner than all the other ones. And when that happened, it was a good indicator that water was coming very quickly and very fast to that inlet, and in a manner that indeed, if you were to see how the flow of waters would go, you see that it all comes and just scours out any sediment that was supposed to be trapped by this fabric material. The reason it fails, the fabric materials clog up. And that's the trouble with using a fabric underneath a grate of any type. And I know our work in Florida, the contractor had the best management practice called a rebar because they would be flooding out and he punched a hole in everything to make it drain. That's obviously defeating the purpose of them. So this particular BMP, even though it's classified as a sediment control measure, it's totally ineffective for most of the time because of the fabric clogging up. Well, let's go and start looking a little bit at the fiber rolls or the wattles that are put supposedly around basins themselves or drainage inlets. On this particular one, we have a whole series of barriers or a whole series of fiber rolls. And if you were to have any water coming off the construction site, in this particular case, all that one fiber roll would do is just be in there to be shoved out into the street. That is not where you want to place those. Plus the fact you got to ask yourself, are the fiber rolls or the wattles, do they float? There are two types of wattles that we got to be aware of. The types that are with lightweight materials and the types that are made with heavyweight material. And the lightweight materials will float. And if water is coming to and making those float, those units will allow lots of sediment laden waters to go into the inlets and defeat the whole purpose. If they don't float in a situation like this, it could very well just shove all that runoff water to a downstream location. So there's some good being intended in here, but the bad obviously is the fact that it's probably not going to be very functional. So that particular one is the sediment control, but I would class it as an ineffective sediment control practice. Well, we get into ones that I swear that they're installed for one reason only, to try to fake out every inspector that goes on a construction site. I look at this particular installation of a silt fence barrier, and I say to myself, what in the world, and when did all of a sudden the criteria for Hawaii become rebar to hold up silt fence barriers? I guess that means we probably are going to use duct tape even there in case occasionally. Picture in the upper right is what we should be looking for, not what we have right here with the yellow circles around there. It does not meet any specifications. Then I take a look at this and I say, why is all this soil piled up right next to the fabric material itself? Well, supposedly, silt fence material is supposed to be trenched into the ground. I have a very strong feeling that this never got trenched into the ground, because if you look in the foreground there, in the distance, excuse me, you'll see there's no dirt out there at all. So this just is silly. We're just simply trying to get by with trying to fake out somebody, when indeed you got to put them in right if they're going to be effective. I know there's no trenching on that second set of silt fence because there's no soil in here that shows that it was ever trenched into the ground. Of course, the question comes up there, why two sets of silt fence materials? That's really what I would classify very distinctly. Yes, a sediment control, but it is nothing but a show and tell product in here. Don't do it that way. All it does is cost a lot of money and it doesn't get you anywhere. Well, let's go and take a look at a couple of projects that might be within the city. Now, in this particular case, there's my inlet and there's the BMP on top of the inlet. I don't think that's very effective. And even though it's classified as maybe a barrier or curb inlet barrier, you have to say it's a very ineffective product because it isn't doing anything. Well, we can see in the background, they're getting ready to do some work. Maybe they took it out early. As long as it doesn't rain, I guess it's okay. But we cause problems for ourselves. And one of the best ways to knock down a lot of that problems that we encounter is to get erosion control going. Well, in this particular case, we got erosion control, which is indirectly a sediment control product. But you might look at any erosion control product that's a vegetation is also for wind erosion control. And yes, this is probably better to be classified as semi-effective, only because it's such steep terrain in there, which you had to go through to make the road be put in there in Hawaii. But it needs to be repaired. It needs to be fixed up. It needs to be taken care of and maintained whenever we have a situation that appears like we see in that picture. Well, this brings up, what legislation are you living under? You're living under the Hawaii Administrative Rules 1155, which I think Claudia talked about. And this is just a quick summary of all the things about 1155. Came in effect in 2019, and it's good until 2024. And basically, it's 474 pages of exciting reading, but it covers everything you need to know about what to do to try to minimize the discharge of pollutants from your construction sites, as well as you take a look at this many other types of scenarios that we're dealing with in here. I'm going to concentrate my topics right there I'm talking about on here to the definitions and what I call Appendix C, what are the BMPs that we need to be dealing with when we're dealing with sediment control. And I start off with a very simple one saying operator or owners, they're the ones that own the facility, which we would expect to be in there. But the big one is the permittee. Contractors, if you pull out a permit and it's issued in your name, you are classified as a permittee. Well, with the DOT, they probably have a blanket one where they get their names being issued to the permittee at all times. Why is that important? It all bases upon one part of 1155 that you and everybody who is a permittee needs to be aware of: maintenance of the BMPs that are installed. And it clearly says that you have to keep all of these measures going. Well, if you as a contractor, if you're representing the wide Department of Transportation, you are the person responsible to make sure that all the BMPs are in a workable manner. And you ought to be doing the inspections as specified in the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. And the other one's a big one right here, says, even though you have a BMP or a series of BMPs that have been approved, if they are not functioning in a correct manner, you are obligated to replace them or to get them fixing so that they in turn will always work the best possible way they possibly can. So in other words, just because you have an approved BMP may not be adequate for the job that you're working on. It's a dynamic situation that we always got to be keeping on top of it here. So what BMPs are going to be taking care of these sediment-laden discharges? Ironically, there are just two. There are two BMPs. One of those BMPs is barriers, and the most effective barrier is the one that results in the development of a sed pond. Trouble with the highway projects, you don't often have the room to be able to install an effective pond, but that is by far the most effective method. The least effective are the ones that you put in front of an inlet. Here's a 10-foot wide wattle. This thing, you better hope that it doesn't rain, because sediment-laden water is going to come in from behind. And apparently there was a little bit of water that came in on the gutter itself, because this unit floated a little bit and water ran underneath and into that inlet itself. So our problem that we got to deal with on here is what's going to be the ones that can be the most cost effective as a contractor to install and to be able to maintain. And it should be as much as you possibly can, and think about erosion control. That's one that is going to be the most effective for you. But unfortunately, too many times we end up trying to remove the sediments that are already suspended in runoff waters. Claudia presented the fact that storm drain inlet protection is the biggest one that's causing problems for everybody. And that's 62, I guess that's 62 observations, but maybe there were 5 inlets within each one of those sites, and you have 62 observations, that's 300 violations, non-compliant situations that come back and nip the permittee right where you don't want to be nipped. The effectiveness of inlet protection. This is what you're looking for. You're looking for sediment that is on the upstream side of the barrier. In Colorado, we call these rock burritos, but that's what you're aiming toward. The trouble is, it's very difficult to do this with many of the techniques that we have at our fingertips. The effectiveness of these particular barriers that we're going to be looking for a check structure is exactly the same type of things that need to be done for what is going to be reducing the sediment for what's going into the inlets of a storm sewer system. The trouble with this is that, yes, we have a barrier. Yes, we have accumulation of sediment, but if you're in a drainage swale, you also got downstream erosion occurring on there. Well, those are things that indeed are problems associated with any construction site that maybe can be taken care of by additional barriers. Well, yes and no. Here's an idealized version of what could be done where you have these stabilized sections close to each other, but let's face it, most of the time on drainage swales, we just put in one barrier and hope that we got it at a location that's going to capture enough sediment. Well, take a look at it. There are two sections that are eroding here, but there's one big section that captures runoff water. And this is identifying and illustrating to everybody that if we capture runoff waters, we're going to be capturing sediment. Because what happens is that there's a pond being developed that reduces the flow of water flowing down a drainage swale. And whenever you're doing this, don't just put in a very short barrier or shallow barrier, put in once at least 12 inches, preferably even 15 inches there, because they in turn need to have enough containment volume behind them there to make a meaningful capture of runoff waters flowing down any drainage swales. And I showed this picture over to the right. These are big rock barriers or rock riprap there, probably D50 of around, I don't know, 8 inches. But look at those dinky ones. For some reason, some people think mixing up large barriers with tiny barriers is a way to go. It's not. It's just a lot of extra work and it doesn't do any good at all. So be careful when you do any of these things and use the right size materials, the right specifications. And reviewers, when you put those in there, be sure that you've looked at everything that says, hey, are we going to have an effective system here? And I put this in here on purpose. Do not use silt fence barriers in drainage channels. They do not work. Matter of fact, if we go through on these things, you can be spending more time doing cleanup than you will ever do and have a benefit of capturing any sediment here. Don't use them and don't design them as such to be in drainage channels. They do not work because they're not meant for concentrated flows. Well, that does beg the question. I say that one time, can it be designed, and can silt fence barriers be designed to use on drainage swales? Yes, if you're careful. For example, if you were to do something like this in a drainage swale where you could capture water and fix it so that it comes and is piled up right next to a pervious silt fence barrier where water goes through that barrier, then you're going to capture some big particles upstream of that. But that takes a lot of good design and good review of the product itself and how you're using it. So you got to be real careful with it and you got to be creative. You are living underneath this installation requirements that says inlet protection measures that'll remove sediment from the discharges. And today, the norm appears to be putting a barrier in front of every inlet opening. And of course, guess what? We get flooding. Now, is it wise to put a barrier in front of all inlets? Good question. And ask the question right now is, how do inlet barriers remove sediment? Actually, they don't. They put up the conditions that allows for the sedimentation of contain of runoff waters. For example, you take a look at this inlet installed on an inlet and a subdivision. If you look right above the barrier itself, you'll see some water's been ponded up in there. And that in turn is doing one thing with the barrier, that is, it's simply shoving the water downstream. Compare that picture you see up there to one where you have sump inlets and you have a barrier, but water comes in from both sides and it creates a pond. It is the pond that is doing the work for reducing the sediment-laden particles that are in runoff waters. And that's what you're looking for, is the development of a pond, which doesn't always go good for developing roadways, does it? So we have to think a little bit differently about this. And this again is the part for reviewers and designers. Think about what's going to happen if you were to have a situation look a little bit like this, and say an Environmental Protection Agency representative came out and did an inspection. That individual comes out there and says, oh, good, you've got a 6-inch high impervious barrier. You have it around the product where you're working at, and also you got it in front of an inlet. And you're saying there, well, I captured some sediment. That sounds good. But you also have erosion. And anybody who does any inspections, hopefully you're seeing stuff like this to say, and asking the question, why are we getting erosion? And we look at this to say, well, water flowed over the barrier. But if you look at it long enough, you're going to find out water flowed under the barrier. So is that barrier really a good barrier to use there? You might find indeed a situation where it says we're getting sediment deposited on the sidewalks and we're getting them in the gutters, but you're also getting it on the pavement. So you're saying, what is it that happened here? Well, assume that a bunch of water came, like it's been illustrated, coming off our site that's under construction, coming down the gutters of the subdivision or the roadway that's under construction. And you start saying, okay, that's a lot of water. Why isn't this barrier doing the job it's supposed to? Well, as that water recedes a little bit, before long, you start finding out that, hey, it captured a little bit of sediment. But boy, there was a situation that says that we didn't get any sediment in the front of this barrier. And by the way, notice how clean that pavement is there compared to some of the sediment that rolled off earlier. Well, when you end up having a clean pavement in front of an inlet, that told you that that barrier did not work. It was totally inadequate. A clean pavement site in front of a barrier is an indication that the barrier was ineffective. And those are the types of things that Claudia was pointing that out to you when you listened to her presentation, because you should be seeing the collection of sediment in front of the barrier every time. Well, where did most of the sediment go? Right into the barrier. If it flowed underneath the impervious barrier over here, the black one, it went underneath it and went right into the inlet. Totally defeated the purpose of the barrier. The other ones rolled over the top and it shoved it downstream there. Well, is it possible that some of the water went into this inlet due to ponding? Well, ponding indicates that we should have had the deposition of sediment. We don't have any deposition of sediment, so we can be pretty well assured that indeed that did not collect any sediment due to runoff. So all of this was predominantly sent off and diverted downstream. And that'd be the situation. You could end up with a situation that looks like this, where a lot of sediment is down at one area that's in a sump. And that is not a good thing to have happening. Because remember, one of the things 1155 says is that you're supposed to keep those things in workable condition. And if they're not capturing sediment, they're not working, that means that you got to replace things in here. In reality, this could very well be a non-compliant sediment control barrier, because if it continually had erosion going underneath it and didn't capture much sediment, somebody could write you up for a non-compliant situation. This rock barrier that we have in here, that's a good illustration of a non-compliant situation. And that is not what you're trying to do. You want to just make these compliant. But there's one big one that's facing everybody, because we put barriers in front of inlets and around construction sites. But we tend to forget that every 14 days and no more than 14 days, you're supposed to stabilize hillsides. That's an EPA requirement. That's the health department requirement. So we have basically a situation here that is predominantly a non-compliant situation if we don't get in there and clean it up and do the maintenance on a timely manner. And that's the key words that come in there. So it's ironic, you may have flooding that exists right into the situation, but that's a pretty good sign that the barriers are causing protection and getting sediment to be deposited. Now you have that criteria that's down below, and if you look at it, and this one also is available to us, says that you can remove these things. But keep in mind that removal of the barriers should be only where safety or loss of property is of concern. Don't just remove the barriers because there's some flooding occurring there. Well, all of this is saying one major thing. If you're going to use any types of barriers in front of a storm sewer system, you got to have flooding. Isn't that a terrible thing to think about? But if you don't have flooding, you don't have a good BMP that's worked there for you. Which says, isn't there got to be some other things that we can apply in here? What is it that we have with something that looks like a sump condition for sedimentation? And we take a look at it and say, okay, that looks like it's doing a job, but if you were to work the numbers, if a lot of sediment laden waters were coming to that barrier, that's a very, very small amount of sediment that's captured, because a lot of the water and sediment itself went over the top of that barrier. So reviewers, designers, when you're putting stuff in there, be careful with these shallow barriers. Be careful with these barriers that indeed are in front of your inlets. If they don't have the right support, they don't have enough volume behind them there, you're going to be in a non-compliant situation that EPA, if they really wanted to, could charge you this much per day per violation. That's what's current for 2021. That value, by the way, will increase in January 15th of 2022. That's by criteria, by law, by Congress. So it's a lot of things that we got to be concerned with in here. Now, let's take a look at area drains that are so often appears on plans. If contractors, if you see any type of illustration like this, first thing you ought to do is throw it away, because it's not supposed to be there for concentrated flows. If you're going to use concentrated flows, you're going to have to shore them up. You're going to have to put bracing in there, because that's the only way these are going to function. They got to have the support. And if you don't want to put in the support, you might want to consider rock or some type of T-post or something in there that can capture the sediment, or go to commercial units. These commercial units can save and capture a tremendous amount of sediment. But every one of these are so much site-driven conditions. Not every highway has all the extra space that they can put in something that you see in the lower right-hand corner here. So it's just one of these things that we've got to be careful of. So what are other methods? Other methods, one of them is inlet inserts, the other one's erosion control. And believe it or not, erosion control can be the least expensive of all your methods. So we'll just show you what we're looking at on here. Inlet inserts, just a bag going right into the insert of the inlet itself. Come in different shapes, come in different forms. Claudia talked about it on her presentation. And there are different types for different situations that you're dealing with. And boy, do they capture sediment. But they do not prevent sediment from going in there. They can only capture a small amount of the total amount of sediment if you have a project that has a lot of sediment, suspended particles in or sediment laden runoff waters. Witch's hats is one that's going in there, but compare the volume of that one to the yellow one you see in here. Usually the witch's hats are in areas that are more urbanized conditions versus where there's a lot of construction going on. But they should not be used as saying, hey, this is all the only method we're going to use for sediment control. Claudia pointed out, and thank you, Claudia, for the use of these photographs. Water goes into the inlet, but there's a little ironic thing apart in here. 1155 says install inlet protective measures that remove sediment from the discharge, but look at the bottom of that sentence, prior to entry into the storm drain inlet. In other words, and this criteria came from EPA, they're almost tying our hands up in here. If you have sediment laden waters and they go into an inlet, you got one of the better methods. And let's just hope that regulatory agencies don't try to ding us here a little bit, because inlet inserts are very effective. And I encourage everybody to think about using them as much as you possibly can. Well, now, what about the erosion control? What BMPs are necessary for the erosion control? Well, one of them we talked about already. It's impervious, and the impervious part is fine. They have diversion structures, temporary soil coverage, and vegetation, but all of it's going to be dependent upon your project, how big it is, how little it is. Diversion structures are a great thing to be considering when you're diverting the water away from an area that's been under construction. What it does is you have a controlled discharge in a controlled channel that you want to make sure that the water's not going to impact the embankment being built or whatever the case may be, or we're removing waters coming off a hillside. And you may even have to use highly impervious like concrete as a way to get the water away from your area that you're concerned with. Or you can use slope drains. Slope drains themselves are a terrific way of conveying water that keeps coming on your projects when you don't want it. We're going to just simply divert it down the slope away from the project site itself. And they're great for highway work. My hat's off and thanks to Barry Fagan for providing this for Alabama, showing that the use of slope drains can be very effective. And if you notice there, the establishment of vegetation goes right along with it. The only problem that I have with roadway slope drains is the entry to it right in here. Often that's just a little too small. Sometimes you need to end up having something a little more robust that can capture a lot more flows, because you don't want to blow out the embankment that the slope drain is being held in there with. Got to do a bunch of staking. I would not use these shallow, these long, like they're survey stakes. Much more robustness needs to be done on there, but they are good. They work. But the other one is contractors. If you got to remove vegetation, don't need to remove it all. Stage the removal of that vegetation, because less soil being exposed means less erosion. Less erosion means less sediment discharges. But I've always keep your topsoil around in there. There are different methods for planting seeds. You probably don't use this in Hawaii. It's the drill or broadcast. The trouble with broadcasting the seed is that it's good for the rodents and birds, and they'll wipe them out. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that hydraulic seeding is very predominantly used. in Hawaii. We have found in areas that are with arid climates, and the islands do have sections that are arid and climates, that you can do a two-step process where the seeds put on first, followed by a hydromulch. So there's different ways of doing it. Just make sure you get everything you possibly can into your tool bag to try to make sure you're controlling erosion as much as possible. An excellent product for erosion control is a soil binder, which literally provides glue on the soil itself. But you got to be very, very careful on how you're doing your slopes themselves. In this particular case, the tracking went along, like you see in here, along the embankment itself, created rills that the materials can just flow right down. This is how tracking should occur, up and down the slope. So these products are good, and how you're doing your tracking is another thing that should be part of the quiver that you're going to be using to somehow minimize the discharge of sediment. The mulch themselves can be wood fiber, be paper mulches. They both work well, but there's a possibility that you could have some problems in there where if you look at it from the top of the hill or from the bottom of the hill, one of it, you'll see some shadowing occurring where you end up having an awful lot of bare soil being exposed. Use erosion control blankets. Very useful, very handy. Big question is, do you need fiber rolls on the blankets? Maybe in Hawaii, the possibility might be that you may need them because they're there to try to intercept the flows that come on the surface, but they're often not needed in areas where you don't have heavy precipitation. So you might have to take a good look at it. Same thing with what's in drainage channels. You may not need fiber rolls in drainage channels because they can be an excess cost, but they can be used and they're nothing wrong with them. Just put them in correctly so they do some benefit to reduce the sediment that can be carried by the runoff flows that go onto your project site itself. So it's very quick little summary that we can put into here on there. There's so many different products out there to use, but we got to keep in mind we can't stop the sediment, but we can sure minimize it. But we've got to fully understand that the minimization itself is going to have some good, it's going to have some bad, and it's going to have some ugly. So we've got to do a lot of good planning and making sure we implement things in a more robust and an accountable manner so that we keep the sediment that's being discharged off our project to minimal itself. Well, that was a pretty quick one going through on here. And I don't know if you got any questions or not on here at all, but let's see what you got for us.
Right on. Thank you, Jerry, for your presentation. So yeah, we're now going to open up the question and answer portion of the session. We just have a few minutes to answer questions, but if you have any, please type them in the Q&A section at this time. It's on the bottom of your screen. If we don't get to them all, we'll record what questions you asked, and then Jerry can reach out via email to answer them.
Absolutely, be absolutely no problem at all. Be sure to send me emails if you do have questions.
All right, the first question we have is what will the fine increase to? And I believe this is in reference to the EPA fine that you mentioned was increasing in January.
That's a very good question. Now, it's tied into the inflation rate. And I saw a news article yesterday said 6%. So maybe that might be what'll happen. We'll just have to wait and see what happens on there. But they've got to post it what the increase is going to be by January 15th of every year. That's by law right now.
All right, thanks, Jerry. And then one more question. Are there methods to prevent pass-through sediments from existing drainage systems into new construction drainage systems? And this will probably be the last question we answer.
Yeah, ask it one more time. I didn't quite fully understand it, Lisa.
Are there methods to prevent pass-through sediments from existing drainage systems into new construction drainage systems?
The proverbial question is, how do you take care of that guy who's not doing any work to try to knock down his sediment here? You could, I think the best way I can see of that would be to maybe develop a series of small set ponds or something there that indeed can capture the water for short durations. But it's a tough one to address when you have sediment laden waters coming into your project site. The only other one is you could almost contact the people above you and say, hey, you've got to start doing something or else I'm going to report you to the health department. And we don't want to really do that, but that's an alternative. That's a real tough one to overcome. I've seen it before on our projects. And the best one is communication. And many times that's all it's going to take is conferring with the guys upstream with you. Sort of a roundabout answer is the best I can give to you on there too.
All right, so we are out of time. Leandro, we got your question. I'll send it over to Jerry and then he can respond to you personally. So thank you again, Jerry. That now concludes this session. Everyone, thank you for attending. The next sessions begin at 10 a.m. So please return to the sessions tab to see the next breakout sessions. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please visit the info desk for assistance. Also, don't forget to stop by and check out the vendors during the break. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.